Hi, today we're going to talk about the discovery of cells and the scientists involved in the discovery of cells. We are also going to take a look at the development of cell theory and the scientists behind the development of cell theory. We're also going to look at prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells and their characteristics and distinguish between the two different cell types. And we're also going to take a look at plant and animal cells, so you could also distinguish between those two cell types as well. So let's get started. Here we have a timeline of the discovery of cells. Now, the discovery of cells would not have been made possible if it weren't for the development of the compound microscope. So way down here in 1590, we have Hans and Zacharias Janssen. They were responsible for producing the first compound microscope. In 1665, Robert Hooke was the first person to observe cells. He was taking a look in the microscope at dead plant cells. He was observing cork, and he thought that they looked like the tiny rooms that monks lived in their monasteries, and thus gave us the term cell. In 1680, Anton van Leeuwenhoek was the first person to observe living cells. Now remember, Robert Hooke was the first person to observe cells, but he was observing dead plant cells. Anton van Leeuwenhoek was the first person to observe living cells. He actually designed his own microscope and he took a look at a whole host of different things, and he observed living protist and bacterial cells. He called them at the time animalcules, but what he in fact was looking at was both protists and bacteria. It wasn't until much later that we have Matthias Schleiden, Theodor Schwann, and Rudolf Virchow, and these scientists were responsible for the development of the cell theory as we know it today. Matthias Schleiden was a botanist, and he was studying plants, and through the course of his research, he concluded that all plants were made up of cells. At the same time, Theodor Schwann was a zoologist, and he was studying animals, and over the course of his research, he also concluded that all animals were made up of cells. Schleiden and Schwann got to talking and they developed the first two parts of cell theory. However, they were unsure about what the third part of cell theory would be, as Schleiden thought that, cells crystallize into formation or kind of spontaneously generated out of nowhere. Schwann didn't necessarily subscribe to this idea, so it wasn't until Rudolf Virchow came along and with his research did they actually come up with the final part of cell theory, that all cells come from pre-existing cells. So here are the three main parts of cell theory. All living things are composed of one or more cells. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function in an organism, and cells come only from the reproduction of existing cells. So Schleiden and Schwann helped with the development of the first two parts of cell theory, and thanks to Virchow, we have our third part of cell theory. Let's take a closer look at both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells are our two main cell types. Prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus, so that means that their DNA or genetic information is not enclosed in a membrane. They have no membrane-bound organelles, but they do contain ribosomes. Ribosomes are made of both RNA and proteins, but they don't have a membrane, so prokaryotic cells do have this organelle. They are small in size. They're anywhere between 1 and 10 micrometers in size, and they are our oldest living cells as they evolved about 3.5 billion years ago. Whether or not we are talking about the kingdom Eubacteria or the kingdom Archaeobacteria, we are talking about our prokaryotic cells. So all of our bacteria are prokaryotic cells. Let's take a look at eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus, which means that their DNA is enclosed in a membrane. They have many different organelles, all membrane-bound organelles, including ribosomes. They're larger in size than prokaryotic cells, as they are anywhere between 2 and 1,000 micrometers in size. They evolved from prokaryotic cells about 1.5 billion years ago, and the rest of our cells are eukaryotic cells. So if we're taking a look at fungi or protists, plants or animals, those are all eukaryotic cells. Here we have a diagram of a prokaryotic cell, and you will see that a prokaryotic cell does have, right here, does have DNA, and it is not enclosed in a membrane. It's freely floating in the cytoplasm. Prokaryotic cells are our simplest cell type, as they only have DNA, cytoplasm, and ribosomes within them. Their DNA, unlike the DNA of prokaryotic, their DNA, unlike the DNA of eukaryotic cells, is circular. So think of their DNA as like a rubber band as opposed to strands of spaghetti like eukaryotic cells' DNA is. Prokaryotic cells have a cell membrane, but they also have a cell wall. Now, the cell wall, or what their cell wall is made up of, is different than that of plant cells. So prokaryotic cells do have a cell wall, but it is different than that of plant cells. Let's take a closer look at animal cells. So eukaryotic cells have a nucleus and do have membrane-bound organelles, as we can see here. They are a more complex cell type, and again, they are all of our different cells aside from bacteria, so protists, plants, and animal cells. So let's take a look at our two main eukaryotic cell types, so plant cells and animal cells. You will be asked to distinguish between plant and animal cells, and the first way to do that is to take a look at their shape. We'll notice that plant cells are rectangular or square in shape, whereas animal cells are circular or irregular in shape. So if you are asked to distinguish between a plant or an animal cell, or asked to identify, are you dealing with a plant cell or are you dealing with an animal cell, you should be able to figure it out just by looking at shape. So if it's rectangular or square in shape, you know you're dealing with a plant cell. If it's circular or irregular in shape, or you really have no idea what the shape is, you're most likely dealing with an animal cell. So just to recap, these are the topics that you will need to be prepared for on either a test or a quiz. So you need to be familiar with the scientists involved in the discovery of cells and the development of cell theory, and those are Hooke, Van Leeuwenhoek, Schleiden, Schwann, and Virchow. You need to be familiar with the three parts of cell theory. You need to be able to distinguish between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, and you also need to be able to distinguish between plant and animal cells. Good luck!